Okay, let's have a look at problem 768. It tells us to use fraction busters in reverse to rewrite the equations below with smaller integer coefficients. To make them easier to solve each equation and check your solution. Okay, so let's start with part A. I have 300x minus 1,500 equals 2,400. So what we want to do is we want to find something that all three of these numbers are divisible by. And of course, we still want to keep integers in our problem. So we're not working with decimals or fractions, integers only. So something that I see for part A, I know already that all of these are divisible by 100. I'm wondering if they are divisible by 300. So 1,500 divided by 300, that would give me 5. So that definitely works. Now is 2,400 divisible by 300? Well, 2,400 is divisible by 300, and that would give us 8. So what we're going to do to use this fraction busters in reverse is we're going to show that we are dividing each of these terms by 300, because when we divide each by 300, we do get a nice integer to work with. So 300 x divided by 300, well, I know that 300 divided by 300 gives me 1. So I'm left with a 1x, or just an x. So x minus, well, we have 1,500 divided by 300, which would give me 5. And finally, 2,400 divided by 300, which would give me 8. So if you compare this equation to this equation, I myself would much rather work with this equation right here. These numbers are much more manageable. Now, if you did solve for A versus this x minus 5 equals 8, you would get the same answer, which is why we would call these equivalent equations. So let's go ahead and solve. I'm going to add 5 to both sides, get a 0 pair here, and I'm left with x equals 13. That's not bad. Now it does tell us to check our solution. So again, we want to go back to the original equation. So if we are going to do 300x, now instead of x, I'm putting in 13. Oops. I'm putting in 13 minus 1,500 equals 2,400. So this is my check. All you need to do is you can plug this into a calculator, or you can work it out on paper. Now, if you plug it into a calculator, you work it out on paper, you should get 2,400, and that would tell us that we were correct and that our solution of x equals 13 is good. All right, on to the next problem then. We have 36 minus 3r equals 18 minus 6r. So you might look at this and say to yourself, well, these are manageable numbers, and I don't mind solving this equation. I can do that. Okay, that's good, and I bet you can do that. But we need to follow the direction. So it tells us that we need to rewrite the equation with smaller integer coefficients. So it will make it easier to solve. And that's the point of the lesson. So don't just solve it as it is. Make sure you're following the directions. And when I look at these, I have a 36, I have a negative 3r, and a negative 6r. So I know, I see, I know I can't, I have a negative 3r or a minus 3r as a coefficient of my r. And I want to make sure that I have only integers. I do not want any fractions. I do not want any decimals when I'm working. I know that 36 is divisible by 3, 18 is divisible by 3, and so is 6 or negative 6. So let's go ahead and divide all of these by 3 to see what we get as an equivalent fraction. So 36 divided by 3 would give me a 12. A negative, minus, so a 3 divided by 3 would just give me r. 18 divided by 3 would give me 6, and minus a 6r divided by 3 would give me a 2r. So again, I would rather work with this equation than the original one, even though the original does seem manageable. This is going to be, nicer numbers to work with. So let's go ahead and solve this out. What I would do is add a 2r here to get a 0 pair. I'm going to add 2r to this side now. So I would get 12 plus r equals 6. Subtract 12 to get a 0 pair. Subtract 12 on this side. I'm left with r equals negative 6. Alright, one more step in this problem, and that is to check our answer. Now, even though we came up with a nicer equivalent equation, we do need to go back to the original equation for a check. And our original equation was 36 minus 3r. So 36 minus 3, instead of r, we're plugging in negative 6 with parentheses, those are very important, equals 18 minus 6r. So equals 18 minus 6. Let's go ahead and plug in that negative 6 for r. And once you solve each of these out, and you can do it by hand, I would also recommend checking it in a calculator just to be sure, for the check anyway. So I would get 54 on this side, and then on my right side I would have 18 minus 6 parenthesis negative 6 end parenthesis, and I end up with 54 on this side as well. So if you do have a calculator and you're putting this in and you don't get 54, that means you're not putting something in correctly. So for both of these, we're good on our solutions, and that is all for problem 768.